PHI 203. You're welcome to study session 8, Psychological Egoism and Moral Egoism. In this study session, we will examine the various types of consequentialist theories, which are psychological egoism and moral egoism. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to discuss the following types of consequentialist theory: ethical egoism and psychological egoism. Types of consequentialist theory. Psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is the argument that has often been used as a basis for the ethical theory of egoism. Adherents of this position hold that we are so constituted or naturally made up to see our personal interests over and above the other people's interests. The argument, therefore, is believed to follow from human nature. Psychological egoism is of the view that whatever we do it because of the value or the advantages that it holds for us, or which we hope to derive from it. In fact, it is argued that no matter how much benefit other people are likely to derive from an action, the moral agent cannot do it unless she stands to gain one thing or the other from its outcome. Some adherents of this idea even posit that it is absolutely impossible for someone to do something for other people if he does not have anything whatsoever to derive as benefit from it. It is usually to object to this line of reasoning by citing various acts of kindness which we have seen or heard about at one time or the other. For example, we might have heard of an instance whereby a man jumped into a house on fire just to save a child whose parents he hardly knew. We are likely to point out that can anybody have anything to gain from such an act of pure benevolence? Furthermore, we might point out that when someone gives a beggar she is not likely to meet again in her lifetime money, can such ever emanate from self-interest? Or in the case of a philanthropist who gives food and clothing to refugees and the destitute, how can the have-not that she is helping ever repay her for her generosity? In response to these instances that seem to disprove the claim of psychological egoism, a psychological egoist usually appeals to intention. In other words, a psychological egoist usually points out that whether or not an action emanates from self-love or self-interest is a function of the aim of the person who performs the action. He often argues further that at the basis of some seemingly altruistic act are personal gains that the doer of the action hopes to get. For example, it is pointed out that people render help most of the times because of the following reasons and other reasons like them. It is argued that a reason might be that the person wants to be helped too, if he in the future or has to face a similar situation. Also, it is pointed out that some help in order to be rewarded by God or a deity that they are devoted to. In addition, it is contended that some help the needy in order to be respected by many people and in order to be known as a good person. Another reason given is that someone might help someone else in a bid to satisfy our conscience or to have peace in our heart. For a psychological egoist, these reasons, which we have mentioned, and other reasons like them, constitute the reason why people actually help or perform the so-called benevolent act. Put differently, a psychological egoist might agree that it is true that we do things for people or render help to them. However, our contention is that our aim is really to be happy or satisfied, and that we have only used the help as a means of getting our aim. If that is the case, therefore, goes the argument, people cannot really be said to be capable of being truly altruistic. In other words, a psychological egoist is of the view that if the world is actually the way she has described it, then it will be both unrealistic and unreasonable not to pursue their self-interest. This, therefore, is the basis that psychological egoists have found for ethical egoism. Thomas Hobbes is an outstanding psychological egoist. He posits in his theory that right from the pre-civil society period, when humans were still in the natural state called the state of nature, people had been selfish, and that all they pursue was what would benefit them alone. Hobbes holds further that even in spite of forming a civil society, they must be put in checks and their conduct regulated by a very powerful sovereign because of their selfish nature. Criticism of psychological egoism. An objection to psychological egoism can be raised in relation to its being used as the basis for ethical egoism. In this instance, the idea is self-contradictory. What this means is that if something is natural for someone, it is not reasonable to ask the fellow be or do that thing again. For example, it is natural for bats to hold tree branches with their feet and turn their heads down. In the light of this, it is what the animal does without waiting to be told to do so. In the same vein, it is not plausible to prescribe that people should do what is in their self-interest, if it is true that it is actually in the nature to be incapable of doing otherwise. Another problem with the descriptive idea of psychological egoism is that what it appeals to in a bid to prove its point, which is intention, is not as observable as it portrays it. Intentions are private experiences. Therefore, if intention is used to prove a point, it cannot be seen or measured, and as a result, the issue at hand cannot be proved or disproved. Such inconclusive evidence, therefore, is not helpful to lay a controversial issue to rest. Ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is a consequentialist normative theory that holds that the moral status of an action is to be determined by its outcome in relation to the moral agent. Going by the foregoing, therefore, it is held that a morally good action is what generates a greater balance of good over evil for the moral agent. As a result, if a moral agent wants to judge the moral status of an action, she must consider whether the action is likely to bring about a greater balance of good over evil for her. If that is the case, then the action is a good action. But if this is not the case, then the action is considered a morally bad action. According to ethical egoism, on the other hand, if someone is called upon to judge a moral action or adjudicate between two people having a moral conflict, ethical egoism holds that the person called upon to pass the moral judgment must do so having as a matter of priority his interest in focus. It might be asked an ethical egoist whether what she means is that it is wrong to help other people. For an ethical egoist, it is not wrong in itself, as long as its long-term effect will eventually be in the interest of the moral agent. Talking about the interest of a moral agent, egoists do not seem to agree on what these interests are in particular. For an egonist, who is also a hedonist, the interest that should be sought is pleasure. For another egoist, however, this interest is happiness. In other egoist view, the interest that should be sought is power. For another, it is in the interest of a moral agent to seek knowledge. On the final note, however, for some ethical egoists, the moral agent's self-interest to be sought is self-realization. Criticisms of ethical egoism. Ethical egoism, as laudable as it seems, poses a number of problems. In the first place, the problem of conflict of interest comes up. This means if everyone is encouraged to pursue him or her self-interest, even at the expense of other people's interests, then there will constantly be clashes of interest. For example, if it is in the interest of a lender to collect twice as much as the original sum from a borrower, and it is also in the interest of a borrower to repay half as much as the original sum, or not even repay at all, how can our lives be free of constant conflict and unending chaos? This rule is found to be in operation mostly among animals. As humans, however, can we hope to live meaningfully if we live by this rule? In another respect, If one goes by the idea of ethical egoism on giving moral counsel, one is bound to give conflicting and inconsistent counsel to different people seeking counsel on the same moral issue. For example, if two children should come to an adult to ask her how they should handle a moral problem, if the adult should go by the principle of ethical egoism, then the children will definitely be more confused than before seeking the counsel. To illustrate this point, let us take a look at the following hypothesis. Tayo says, "Uncle, please, I need your advice. I borrowed some money from." Beatrice says, "Although I promised to repay, and I have some money with which I can pay, I just realized that I will not be able to buy some things which I also so much love to buy if I give the money." Uncle says, "Your duties and obligations are forced to yourself. Do what is in your best interest." Beatrice says, "Uncle, I lent Tayo some money, but I want to collect the money before the time that he promised to repay." Uncle replied, "Your duties and obligations are forced to yourself. Do what is in your best interest." If one considers the advice of Uncle to Tayo and Beatrice, one will see the inconsistencies involved. If the two should follow the advice of the uncle, the implication of the advice is that Tayo is morally obliged to do all he can to evade the repayment, and Beatrice is equally morally required to collect the money before the date earlier agreed on by the two. The third objection of the theory of ethical egoism is that the other side of it in relation to giving moral judgment shows that it weakens the ideal or the appropriate moral point of view. What this implies is that if one goes by the ideal of ethical egoism, that a moral judgment should look out for our own interest rather than the interest of moral agents, then it becomes obvious that the whole essence of moral judgment becomes ineffective. The reason for this is that moral judgment requires that an ideal observer or judge be objective and impartial. In an instance, however, when a judge cannot keep this simple requirement of moral judgment, our activities become meaningless. Lastly, ethical egoism as a moral theory frustrates the purpose of morality. One of the cardinal purposes of morality is to achieve peace and order in the society. Since our society is made up of more than one individual, morality presupposes that each person sacrifices a little of her interest in order to have a peaceful and orderly society. This is, however, contrary to the theory of ethical egoism. This shows, therefore, that ethical egoism is not in line with a very important reason for morality. Study session summary. In this study session, we discussed psychological egoism and moral egoism. We stated that psychological egoism is a descriptive theory which claims that humans have been observed to behave in a particular way. According to psychological egoism, human beings are naturally selfish and self-seeking. Ethical egoism, on the other hand, is a theory that prescribes how human beings should behave. According to ethical egoism, an action is morally good if it brings about a greater balance of good over evil for moral agents, but an action is morally bad if it does not generate the positive result for the moral agent. An objection which critics have raised against the two theories is that it is self-contradictory to infer that people should always seek their self-interest from the premise that people naturally seek their self-interest. We have now come to the end of study session 8. Thanks for listening.